The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting a shimmering golden glow across the dry expanse of savanna. Peter wiped the sweat from his brow as he bent over his vegetable patch, the sweltering heat sapping his energy. His small farm, perched on the edge of a sprawling wildlife reserve, was a sanctuary of sorts, not just for him, but for the occasional stray animals that wandered through. Though Peter often heard the distant cries of wildlife or the low grumbles of elephants, he had learned to live alongside nature, never intruding beyond his humble plot. As he straightened up to stretch his back, a faint rumble reached his ears. At first, he dismissed it as the vibrations of a passing vehicle or perhaps a distant herd of wildebeests. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble ever so slightly. Peter froze, his senses sharpening. Something was off. He walked to the edge of his property, where the wild grasses met the tilled soil of his farmland. Scanning the horizon, he saw it. A massive rhino, its gray hide glinting faintly in the sunlight. Peter's breath caught. The creature was unmistakable, its hulking frame moving steadily toward him. Yet its behavior was strange. It wasn't grazing or wandering aimlessly as rhinos often did. Instead, it seemed to be headed directly for him. Peter instinctively stepped back, his heart pounding. Rhinos were notoriously unpredictable and could be dangerous if provoked. He glanced toward his small farmhouse, considering retreat, but something in the animal's demeanor made him hesitate. It wasn't charging, nor did it seem aggressive. If anything, it looked exhausted. The rhino's head hung low, and its steps were labored, each one heavier than the last. As it drew closer, Peter noticed dark streaks on its leg blood. His stomach churned. The rhino was injured, and badly. Despite the fear coursing through him, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature. It stopped just a few meters from him, its massive body casting a shadow over the ground. Peter could now see the source of the bleeding. A rusted metal snare was tightly wrapped around its leg, cutting into the thick skin. The wound was raw and swollen, and flies buzzed around it. Peter's instinct screamed at him to turn and run. This was a wild animal, one of the largest and most formidable on the continent. Yet the rhino didn't move to attack. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, its dark, liquid eyes locking onto his. Peter's breath hitched. Those eyes, so full of pain and desperation, seemed to plead with him. He felt a lump rise in his throat. This was no ordinary encounter. The animal had sought him out, crossing the savanna and approaching his farm, as if knowing he might help. The idea seemed absurd, yet here it was, standing before him, vulnerable and waiting. Peter's mind raced. He wasn't a veterinarian, nor did he have any experience handling such situations. The most he had ever done was patch up the occasional wound on his chickens. But could he really turn his back on this creature? Could he walk away, knowing it might not survive the night? Slowly, cautiously, Peter stepped toward the house. He kept his movements deliberate, glancing over his shoulder to ensure the rhino wasn't following. It stayed in place, watching him, its labored breaths audible even from a distance. Inside, Peter rummaged through his meager supplies. He grabbed a machete, a pair of thick gloves, and the small first aid kit he kept for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His hands shook as he stuffed the items into a canvas bag. He glanced at the phone on his kitchen table, but the thought of calling someone for help felt futile. By the time anyone arrived, the rhino might be gone, or worse. When he stepped back outside, the rhino was still there, its massive frame motionless except for the rise and fall of its chest. Peter's heart pounded as he approached. Every step felt like a gamble. What if the animal panicked? What if it misinterpreted his intentions? "Easy now," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. He wasn't sure why he spoke. It wasn't like the rhino could understand him, but it felt natural, as if the words might somehow bridge the gap between them. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the deep grooves the snare had left in the rhino's skin. The wound was worse than he had realized. The flesh around the metal wire was raw and oozing, and the stench of infection was starting to set in. Peter swallowed hard, trying to ignore the wave of nausea that rose in his chest. With trembling hands, he reached into his bag and pulled out the machete. The rhino snorted loudly, its ears twitching. Peter froze, his heart hammering. For a moment, he thought the animal might charge, but it stayed in place, watching him closely. "I'm just trying to help," Peter said softly. He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, the rhino or himself. He moved closer, inch by inch, until he was within arm's reach of the animal's leg. The heat radiating off its body was almost palpable, and the sheer size of the creature made Peter feel impossibly small. He could see every wrinkle in its hide, every fleck of dust that clung to its rough skin. Gripping the machete tightly, he positioned the blade against the rusted wire. It was a delicate task. The snare was embedded so deeply that he had to be careful not to cut into the rhino's flesh. Sweat dripped down his face as he worked, his hands slick with nervous perspiration. The rhino shifted slightly, and Peter froze. Its dark eyes met his again, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was no fear in those eyes, no anger, only a quiet, unspoken trust. It was as if the animal understood he was trying to help. Peter resumed his work, his movements careful and deliberate. The metal wire resisted at first, but with a few determined strikes, it began to give. Finally, with one last effort, the snare snapped free. The rhino let out a low, guttural grunt, a sound that reverberated through Peter's chest. He stepped back, his hands trembling. The creature shifted its weight, testing its leg. Though the wound was still raw and painful, it was free of the snare's cruel grip. Peter reached for the first aid kit and poured water over the wound, washing away the dirt and blood as best he could. He applied antiseptic cream, his hands shaking the entire time. The rhino didn't move, standing stoically as he worked. When he finally stepped away, the rhino lifted its head, its massive horn glinting in the sunlight. For a moment, it simply stood there, its eyes locked on his. Then, to Peter's astonishment, it nudged him gently with its head. The gesture nearly knocked him off balance, but it wasn't aggressive. It felt grateful. Peter's chest tightened. He had never felt anything like this before, a connection so profound, so primal. Before he could fully process the moment, the rhino turned and began to walk away. It stopped a few paces ahead and turned to look back at him, as if inviting him to follow. Peter hesitated, glancing back at his farm. But the pull of the rhino was irresistible. He grabbed his bag and stepped forward, trailing after the creature into the unknown. Peter followed the rhino with a mix of trepidation and curiosity, his boots crunching against the dry grass as the animal limped ahead. The air was heavy with the sounds of the savanna, the rustle of the wind through the tall grasses, the distant call of birds, and the occasional snort or grunt from the rhino itself. Each step he took felt surreal. How had he found himself here, trailing a wild animal into the unknown? And yet, something inside him refused to turn back. The rhino moved slowly, its injured leg clearly causing it pain. Peter couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, knowing the creature might have been suffering like this for days, possibly longer. The snare had been brutal, biting deep into the flesh, and the wound still looked angry and raw. Peter wished he could have done more than just clean it and apply antiseptic, but he had done the best he could with what little he had. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the savanna. Peter glanced behind him, seeing his farm shrinking into the distance. He should have felt nervous about wandering so far from home, but the rhino's deliberate movements captivated him. It was as if the animal had a purpose, a destination in mind. Occasionally, it would glance back at him, a brief flicker of its dark, expressive eyes, as though checking to make sure he was still there. "Where are you taking me?" Peter murmured to himself, half expecting no answer, half expecting some kind of sign. The rhino responded only by plodding forward, its steps uneven but determined. After what felt like an eternity, the landscape began to shift. The open grasslands gave way to a scattering of acacia trees, their gnarled branches stretching skyward. The air grew cooler as the shadows lengthened, and Peter noticed a faint sound of running water in the distance. The rhino's pace quickened slightly, its heavy frame pushing through the brush with a newfound urgency. Then Peter saw it, a shallow ravine, its edges lined with jagged rocks. The sound of water came from a narrow stream that cut through the bottom. At first glance, it seemed like an unremarkable spot, but the rhino's behavior changed dramatically as they approached. It let out a low, guttural grunt and turned to Peter, its large head dipping toward the ravine. Peter stopped, confused. "What is it?" he asked aloud, though he hardly expected an answer. He stepped closer, peering into the ravine. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the rocky terrain and the slow trickle of the stream. But then his eyes caught movement. Something small and gray wedged between two rocks near the edge of the water. It was a calf. Peter's heart clenched as he realized what he was seeing. The young rhino was trapped, its front leg pinned awkwardly between the stones. It struggled feebly, letting out soft, pitiful cries that echoed through the ravine. The mother rhino, Peter assumed it was the mother, grunted again, pacing near the edge of the drop-off. She nudged the ground with her horn, as if urging Peter to do something. "Oh no," Peter whispered, his stomach twisting. The calf couldn't have been more than a few months old, its small, pudgy body a stark contrast to the imposing bulk of its mother. The sight was heartbreaking. Peter hesitated, his mind racing. Getting down into the ravine wouldn't be easy, and even if he managed it, freeing the calf from the rocks would be a challenge. But as he glanced at the mother rhino, standing protectively above her baby, he knew he couldn't walk away. "All right," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll do what I can." He slung his bag over his shoulder and carefully made his way down the uneven slope. The rocks were loose and jagged, and several times he nearly lost his footing. He could feel the weight of the mother rhino's gaze on him as he descended. She stayed near the edge of the ravine, snorting anxiously and shifting her weight from one foot to the other. When Peter reached the bottom, he approached the calf slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The young rhino let out a frightened squeal, its small eyes wide with panic. Peter knelt down a few feet away, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you." The calf stopped struggling for a moment, its breathing ragged and uneven. Peter could see how tightly its leg was wedged between the rocks, and his heart sank. The stones were heavy and tightly packed, and it would take every ounce of his strength to move them. He set to work immediately, prying at the rocks with his hands. They were rough and unyielding, and his fingers quickly became raw and sore. Sweat dripped down his face as he strained against the unrelenting weight. He grabbed his machete and used it as a lever, wedging the blade between two of the larger stones and pushing with all his might. The first rock shifted slightly, and Peter felt a flicker of hope. He redoubled his efforts, ignoring the burning in his arms and the ache in his back. After several minutes of grueling work, the stone finally gave way, tumbling to the side with a dull thud. The calf let out a startled cry, but Peter spoke to it soothingly. "Almost there," he said, his voice strained. "Just a little more." One by one, he loosened the remaining rocks until the calf's leg was free. The young rhino scrambled to its feet, wobbling unsteadily for a moment before finding its balance. Peter stepped back, breathing heavily, and watched as the calf limped toward its mother, letting out a high-pitched call. The mother rhino responded immediately, descending into the ravine with surprising grace. She nuzzled her calf gently, inspecting it for injuries. Peter stood frozen, awestruck by the scene. He had never witnessed such a display of maternal affection up close. It was both humbling and profoundly moving. After a moment, the mother turned her attention to Peter. She approached him slowly, her massive frame casting a shadow over him. Peter's pulse quickened, unsure of what to expect. But instead of showing aggression, the rhino stopped a few feet away and bowed her head slightly. Peter felt his breath catch. It was a gesture of gratitude, unmistakable in its intent. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You're welcome," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the stream. He felt a lump rise in his throat, overwhelmed by the raw, unspoken connection between them. The mother rhino lingered for a moment longer before turning back to her calf. Together, they made their way out of the ravine, the mother nudging her baby along gently. Peter watched them go, his heart heavy with emotion. As he climbed back up the slope, exhaustion began to set in, but so did a deep sense of fulfillment. He had done something good, something meaningful, and though he didn't know what the future held, he felt a newfound sense of purpose stirring within him. When he reached the top, he turned to look back one last time. The mother rhino and her calf were little more than silhouettes against the setting sun, moving steadily toward the horizon. Peter stood there for a long time, watching them disappear into the vast expanse of the savannah. The next morning began with a peaceful hush, the kind that made the savannah seem like an endless expanse of tranquility. Peter woke with a lingering sense of fulfillment, the events of the previous day playing vividly in his mind. His body ached from the exertion of freeing the calf, but the memory of the mother rhino's gesture of gratitude made every sore muscle worth it. As he stepped out onto his porch, the air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint, earthy smell of dew-soaked grass. He poured himself a cup of tea, savoring the rare moment of stillness. Yet, even as he gazed out over the horizon, he felt a nagging unease tugging at the edges of his thoughts. The image of the snare that had injured the mother rhino haunted him. Poachers. It was the only explanation. The reserve's rangers did their best to patrol the area, but it was vast and resources were stretched thin. Peter had always been aware of the danger posed by poachers, but until now, it had felt distant, a shadowy threat lurking far beyond the boundaries of his small farm. He set his cup down, determined to shake the uneasy feeling. There was work to be done, after all, and dwelling on what he couldn't control wouldn't help anyone. He grabbed his tools and headed toward the fields, ready to lose himself in the comforting rhythm of tending his crops. The peace didn't last long. A sharp, percussive sound split the air, startling Peter so badly that he dropped his spade. His heart lurched as the sound echoed again, the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. He froze, straining to pinpoint the direction it had come from. Somewhere toward the reserve's boundary, perhaps a kilometer away. Panic surged through him. He thought of the mother rhino and her calf, still vulnerable after yesterday's ordeal. Were they in danger? His instinct screamed at him to stay put. He was just a farmer, unarmed and untrained for this sort of thing. But the memory of the rhino's pleading eyes, the trust she had shown him, drove him to action. Peter sprinted back to his house, grabbing his machete and an old pair of binoculars. He had no plan, no idea what he was walking into, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that the rhinos were in trouble. His chest tightened as he ran, the adrenaline coursing through him, drowning out any second thoughts. The terrain grew rougher as he left the familiar confines of his farm and ventured closer to the reserve. The grass was taller here, the ground uneven and littered with rocks. Peter stumbled several times but pressed on, guided by the distant sound of raised voices. When he crested a small hill, he dropped to his stomach, peering through the binoculars. The scene below made his blood run cold. 3 men stood in a loose circle, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Nearby, the mother rhino and her calf were backed against a cluster of trees, the calf trembling visibly as it pressed against its mother's side. The mother snorted and pawed the ground, her horn gleaming menacingly in the sunlight, but her limp was evident. She couldn't charge effectively, and the poachers seemed to know it. Peter's hands tightened around the binoculars. He couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. But what could he do? He was outnumbered and outmatched. The machete at his side suddenly felt laughably inadequate. One of the poachers raised his rifle, taking aim at the mother rhino. Peter's heart slammed against his ribs. He had to act now. Without giving himself time to think, he stood and shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Hey, get away from them!" The poachers turned in unison, their faces a mixture of surprise and annoyance. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, stepped forward, leveling his rifle in Peter's direction. "And who do you think you are, farmer?" the man called, his voice dripping with contempt. This isn't your business." Peter's throat went dry, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "You're on reserve land," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The Rangers will be here any minute." The lie felt flimsy even as he spoke it. The poachers exchanged glances, their confidence unshaken. The one with the shaved head smirked, taking a few steps closer. "Nice try," he said, "but there's no one coming. You should walk away while you still can." Peter's pulse thundered in his ears. The poachers weren't bluffing, they didn't believe him, and they had no reason to back down. He glanced at the rhinos, who remained cornered, their fear palpable. He couldn't let this happen, not after everything they'd been through. Just as Peter opened his mouth to shout again, a deep, resonant sound cut through the tension. A low, rumbling snort, followed by the thunder of hooves. Peter barely had time to process what was happening before another rhino burst through the underbrush. A massive bull, its horn gleaming like a weapon of war. The poachers scattered in an instant, their bravado evaporating as the bull charged. One man tripped and fell, scrambling to his feet as the rhino barreled past him. Another dropped his rifle entirely, disappearing into the trees with a string of panicked curses. The bull snorted furiously, its sheer size and power overwhelming any thoughts of resistance. Peter could only watch, stunned, as the bull positioned itself protectively in front of the mother and her calf. It let out a loud, guttural bellow, stamping its feet and daring the poachers to return. None of them did. The last of the men vanished into the brush, their shouts fading into the distance. When the chaos subsided, Peter found himself standing motionless, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing. The bull rhino turned its massive head toward him, its dark eyes calm and assessing. For a brief moment, they locked eyes, and Peter felt the same unspoken connection he had experienced with the mother rhino. This creature wasn't just acting on instinct. It was protecting its own, and somehow, it had understood Peter's role in the unfolding events. The mother rhino and her calf remained where they were, the calf letting out a soft, plaintive cry. The bull snorted once more before retreating into the brush, its job done. Peter stood frozen, watching as the mother limped forward, nudging her calf gently toward the open savanna. She paused only briefly, her gaze lingering on Peter as though acknowledging him one last time. And then, they were gone, their silhouettes fading into the golden light of the savanna. Peter sank to his knees, the adrenaline leaving his body in a rush that left him trembling. He had never been so terrified in his life, but he had also never felt so alive. The rhinos were safe, for now, but the encounter had left an indelible mark on him. He knew, deep in his heart, that he couldn't go back to his old life. Not after this. The poachers might return, and there would be other rhinos, other animals in need. Peter clenched his fists, a new resolve burning in his chest. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to protect them. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph, the sun warming his face as he sat alone in the vast expanse of the savanna. Peter sat on the edge of his porch, staring out at the horizon as the first rays of sunlight painted the savanna in hues of gold and amber. His hands cradled a mug of lukewarm tea, but he wasn't drinking. His mind was too full, replaying the events of the last 2 days in vivid detail. The mother rhino's desperate plea, the calf trapped in the ravine, the terrifying confrontation with the poachers, and the miraculous intervention of the bull rhino. It all felt surreal, like fragments of a dream that lingered too long. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. The rawness in his muscles, the blisters on his hands, and the faint ache in his heart were proof of that. Since the encounter, Peter had been restless. Every creak of the windmill, every distant sound from the reserve set his nerves on edge. He couldn't stop worrying about the rhinos. Were they safe? Had the poachers regrouped and returned to finish what they'd started? His farm, once his sanctuary, now felt like a fragile outpost on the edge of something far larger and more dangerous. By mid-morning, he decided he couldn't sit idle any longer. He had to do something. The weight of inaction was unbearable. With a renewed sense of purpose, Peter packed a bag with water, a few tools, and his binoculars. He slung his machete over his shoulder and set off toward the reserve, determined to check on the rhinos. The walk was long and grueling, the sun beating down relentlessly. Sweat soaked through Peter's shirt as he navigated the uneven terrain, his eyes scanning for any sign of the animals. The grasslands stretched endlessly before him, dotted with acacia trees and the occasional scatter of rocks. It was easy to feel small out here, like a solitary figure in a world too vast to comprehend. Finally, after hours of searching, Peter spotted movement in the distance. He raised his binoculars, his heart leaping as he recognized the familiar hulking forms. The mother rhino and her calf were grazing near a shallow waterhole, their gray hides blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. Relief washed over him, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But as he watched, something else caught his attention. The calf was limping, its movements hesitant and unsteady. The mother stayed close, her body positioned protectively, but it was clear that both animals were still vulnerable. Peter's chest tightened. They weren't out of danger yet. He edged closer, keeping low to avoid alarming them. The last thing he wanted was to spook the mother into charging. As he approached, he noticed that the bull rhino was nearby, standing watch a short distance away. Its massive frame was a reassuring presence, but Peter knew it couldn't protect them forever. Peter crouched behind a cluster of bushes, debating what to do. He wanted to help, but what could he realistically offer? He wasn't a veterinarian, and he had no experience caring for wild animals. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here, that the rhinos had come into his life for a reason. As he mulled over his next move, a faint rustling sound reached his ears. He stiffened, every muscle in his body tensing as he turned toward the noise. His blood ran cold when he saw them. Two figures moving stealthily through the tall grass, rifles slung over their shoulders. Poachers. Again, Peter's mind raced. There was no time to think, only to act. He pulled out his phone, praying for a signal. To his immense relief, a single bar flickered into view. He quickly dialed the reserve's emergency line, whispering into the receiver as he described the situation. The ranger on the other end assured him that help was on the way, but Peter knew it would take time for them to arrive. Too much time. The poachers were getting closer to the waterhole, their movements deliberate and practiced. Peter's heart pounded as he realized they were setting up to take a shot. His gaze darted to the bull rhino, which seemed unaware of the threat, and then to the mother and calf, still grazing peacefully by the water's edge. He had to buy them time. Adrenaline surged through him as he stood, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Hey, get out of here!" The poachers froze, startled by his sudden appearance. One of them raised his rifle, aiming in Peter's direction, but the other grabbed his arm, muttering something Peter couldn't hear. They hesitated, clearly debating whether he was alone or if reinforcements might be nearby. Peter didn't wait to find out what they would decide. He picked up a large rock and hurled it in their direction, missing by several feet, but achieving the desired effect. The poachers swore loudly, retreating a few steps as they scanned the area for signs of other people. At that moment, the bull rhino lifted its head, sensing the commotion. It let out a deep, guttural snort, its ears twitching as it locked onto the poachers. The men froze, their bravado evaporating as the massive creature began to move toward them. One of them cursed, dropping his rifle as he turned to run. The other followed, their retreat as chaotic as their approach had been. Peter sank to his knees, his chest heaving as he watched them disappear into the distance. His entire body was shaking, but a wave of triumph surged through him. The poachers were gone, for now. The bull rhino stopped a few meters away, turning its gaze toward Peter. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Peter felt a lump rise in his throat as he realized the animal had been watching over the mother and calf, just as he had. When the rangers arrived half an hour later, Peter recounted everything that had happened. They praised his bravery, though one of them shook his head in disbelief. "You're lucky to be alive," the ranger said. "Poachers like that don't play games." Peter nodded, the weight of the day settling heavily on his his shoulders. He knew he had taken a huge risk, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. As the rangers secured the area and began tracking the poachers, Peter turned back toward the waterhole. The rhinos were still there, the mother and calf grazing peacefully, while the bull stood watch nearby. It was in that moment that Peter made a decision. He couldn't go back to his old life, not after this. The rhinos had shown him something profound, an unbreakable bond, a resilience in the face of danger, and a silent plea for protection. He didn't just want to help them, he needed to. Over the following weeks, Peter threw himself into learning everything he could about rhino conservation. He connected with local wildlife organizations, offering his time and his land as a base for monitoring efforts. He even began working with the reserve's rangers, patrolling the boundaries and helping to maintain the fences that kept the animals safe. Months later, Peter stood on the edge of the savanna, watching the sun dip below the horizon. In the distance, he spotted the familiar shapes of the mother rhino and her calf, now stronger and healthier. The bull rhino was nearby, as vigilant as ever. Peter felt a deep sense of peace as he watched them, knowing he had found his purpose. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a guardian, a voice for the voiceless, and a part of something far greater than himself. And as the stars began to fill the sky, Peter smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of his journey.